All right, so you wanted to dive into the WAQF Act of 1995. Well, buckle up because we're going deep today.
You got it. We're talking about a significant piece of Indian law, one that deals with the whole system of how WAQF are run.
It can seem a little daunting at first glance, but we're going to break it down, give you the essentials, help you navigate this.
Consider this your shortcut to really understanding the WAC Act. No need to wade through pages and pages of legalese.
So, like we always do, let's lay out the roadmap. First things first.
Yeah.
What are we looking at today?
Well, we're going straight to the source. We're talking about the official, the WAC Act 1995 document itself. You can find it on the Central WAC Council website.
Right from the horse's mouth,
Yeah.
straight to the definitions, the structure, and how it's supposed to work according to the Act.
Exactly. No interpretations, just the law as it's written.
So what's our mission for today's deep dive? We're going to try and give you, the listener, a crystal clear understanding of what this WAC Act is all about.
We'll hit those key definitions that form the foundation. Then we'll look at how WACA boards are set up and what their role is.
Then we'll unravel the registration process for WAQF, delve into the responsibilities of those folks called mutawalis, and explore the judicial side of things, how disputes are settled.
We want to extract the core, the essence of this law, without overwhelming you with legal jargon. Just the good stuff.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly are we talking about when we say WAQF?
Well, the Act gives us a pretty thorough definition. It says a WAF is, and I'm quoting here, the permanent dedication by any person of any movable or immovable property for any purpose recognized by the Muslim law as pious, religious, or charitable.
So any property basically dedicated for a good cause, according to Muslim law. Pretty straightforward.
It is, but there are some interesting nuances here. The definition goes on to include a few specific categories, like WAC by user.
WAQF by user. So it's not just about a formal written declaration.
Not necessarily. You see, the Act recognizes that sometimes a WACF might be established through long-standing customary use. Like, if a piece of land has traditionally been used for prayers or a community gathering with a religious purpose, that could fall under WAF by user.
Interesting. So it takes into account historical practices as well.
It does. And there are a couple other terms in there that also point to this recognition of customary practices, like Shamlat Padi, Shamlat Day, Jumla Malkin. These are terms that often refer to land used for common purposes within a village or community, and the Act acknowledges that these can sometimes have a WAC character.
Okay, so the definition of WAF is pretty broad, encompassing both formal and informal dedications. Now, you also mentioned Waqf al-Awlad. What's that all about?
Ah, that's an interesting one. Waqala Aulad is a kind of endowment where the initial beneficiaries are the founder's own family.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. To be considered a WAF under this Act, it has to eventually be dedicated to a broader public good, like charity or religious purposes.
So it can start as a family thing, but it can't stay that way forever. It has to ultimately benefit the wider community.
Exactly. The Act puts a limit on how long that family benefit can last. The ultimate purpose has to be something considered pious, religious, or charitable under Muslim law.
That makes sense. It ensures that even endowments that begin as family-focused eventually serve a wider public purpose. Now, let's talk about the person making the dedication, the one we call WAQF.
Right, the WAQF is the founder, the one who sets up the WAQ. They're the ones making that initial dedication of property.
So in essence, they're like the cornerstone of the whole WAQ. Without them, there's no dedication, no property set aside for a good cause.
Exactly. They're the initiators, the ones who decide, I want to dedicate this property for this particular religious or charitable purpose.
All right, so we've got the WAQ, the dedicated property, and the WAQF, the founder. Now, there's another term that pops up a lot, mutawali. Who's that?
The mutawali is, in a nutshell, the manager, the administrator of the WAC. They're the ones responsible for making sure things run smoothly, according to the WAQF's wishes and the rules of the Act.
So they're the ones on the ground handling the day-to-day operations of the WAC.
Precisely. The Act defines a mutawali as any person appointed either verbally or under any deed or instrument by which a WAC has been created, or by a competent authority to be the manager or administrator of the WAC or WAC property. So they could be appointed in a few different ways, but their role is essentially the same.
They're the caretakers, making sure the WAF is managed properly and its purpose is fulfilled. But the Act is specific about who can be a mutawali, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just anyone who can step into this role. The Act makes it clear that a mutawali has to be an Indian citizen, and they have to meet certain qualifications, which are laid out in the Act itself.
So there are some basic requirements to ensure they're fit for the job.
Right. And here's another interesting layer. The original WAC deed or even state government rules can add on extra qualifications.
Yeah.
Like maybe the WAQF specify that the Mutawali must have certain expertise or experience.
So the qualifications can be tailored to the specific needs of the WAC. It's about finding the right person for the job, someone who can effectively manage the property and fulfill its purpose.
Exactly. It's about ensuring the WAC is in capable hands.
Now, the Act also keeps mentioning this thing called a board. What's that all about?
Okay, so the board, in the context of this act, is short for Board of WAC. This is like the big supervisory body. They're the ones who oversee all the OQF in a particular state, or sometimes even across multiple states.
Ah, so they're like the regulatory body making sure everything is running according to the Act.
Exactly. They're a key part of that better administration that the act is aiming for. They set the rules, they monitor, they make sure things are being done properly.
Okay, so that's the board. We've covered the basic building blocks. WAF, WAQF, Mutawali, and board. Now, how does the Act actually structure the administration of all these AQUAs?
Right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Chapter 4 of the Act is all about how these boards are set up and what they do. It mandates that each state government has to establish a board of OQF for their state.
So each state has its own board overseeing all the AQUAF within its borders. Makes sense.
Yeah, but here's where it gets interesting. If a state has a significant Shia Muslim population, the Act says they can choose to set up separate boards for Sunni and Shia OQF.
Ah, so they can have two separate boards if needed. But what does significant mean in this context? How do they decide?
Well, the Act lays it out pretty clearly. A significant Shia population means either more than 15% of the Awqaf in the state are Shia Awqaf, or the income from those Awqaf is more than 15% of the total income from all Awqaf in the state.
Okay, so it's based on either the number of Shia AQUAF or the proportion of income they generate. So if a state has a large Shia community, they have the flexibility to create separate boards to cater to the specific needs of each sect.
Exactly. It's about ensuring representation and appropriate management for both communities.
Now, you mentioned that these boards are incorporated bodies. What does that even mean? It sounds kind of technical.
It is a bit technical, but it's an important distinction. What incorporated means is that the board becomes its own legal entity. It's separate from the individuals who are members of the board.
So it's like a company, almost.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. It means the board can own property in its own name, it can enter into contracts, it can sue or be sued in court, all under its own identity.
So it's not just a bunch of people meeting together. It's an actual legal entity with its own rights and responsibilities.
Exactly. And that's important because it gives the board the power and flexibility to effectively carry out its role in managing OQF.
Makes sense. So we've got these boards, they're incorporated bodies, and they're responsible for overseeing WAQF. But who sits on these boards? Who are the members?
Okay, so the composition of these boards is outlined in Section 14 of the Act. And it's actually designed to be quite diverse, to bring in a range of perspectives.
So it's not just like a bunch of religious scholars or something.
No, not at all.
Oh.
The members include Muslim members of parliament and state legislatures from the state. So you've got representation from elected officials right there.
Okay, so there's a political element to it. What else?
You also have Muslim members of the State Bar Council, so there's legal expertise being brought in.
Right, ensuring things are done by the book. Makes sense.
And then you've got Mutawalis of OQF that have an annual income of 1 lakh rupees or more.
So people who are actually managing OQF on the ground who have experience with the day-to-day realities.
Exactly. And to round things out, there's also a Muslim officer from the state government, someone who's at least a joint secretary rank who's nominated by the government.
So there's a government oversight element as well. It's quite a mix.
It is. And there are specific provisions for representation from union territories as well. Plus, the Act mandates that at least 2 members of each board have to be women.
Oh, that's good. Ensuring women have a voice in the management of AQF.
Exactly.
Hey.
And just as importantly, the Act explicitly says that ministers can't be members of the board.
Ah, so it's trying to keep the boards somewhat independent of direct political control.
Exactly. It's about having a balanced and representative body that can act in the best interests of the AQF.
All right, so that's how the membership is set up. It's a pretty diverse group, bringing in a range of expertise and experience. But how do they actually get on the board? Is it all appointments?
Not entirely. The elected members are chosen through a system called proportional representation using a single transferable vote.
Proportional representation, single transferable vote. It sounds complicated.
It is a bit, but essentially it's a system designed to make sure different groups within the Electoral College are represented fairly on the board.
So it's not just the majority winning everything. It's about ensuring that different voices and interests have a seat at the table.
Exactly. And the Act has some special provisions for situations where there might only be one Muslim representative in a certain category. Like if there's only one Muslim member of parliament from a particular state.
So they make sure even those lone representatives get a say in the election process.
Yep. It's all about ensuring representation and fairness.
So we've established how these boards are set up, who the members are, how they're chosen. Now, the big question, what do they actually do? What are their powers and functions?
Well, the Act lays all that out in Section 32. And let me tell you, it's a pretty long list.
So these boards have a lot of power, a lot of responsibility.
They do. Perhaps their biggest power is that they have what the Act calls general superintendents over all the WAQF in the state.
General superintendents. It sounds very official, very powerful. What does that actually mean?
Basically, it means they're the top dogs. They're responsible for making sure all the WAQF are being managed properly, that the rules are being followed, that the WAQF's intentions are being honored.
They're like the watchdogs, keeping an eye on everything.
Exactly. And to do that, they have a whole bunch of specific powers and duties. Like they have to maintain detailed records of all the WAQF in the state.
So keeping track of everything, making sure there's transparency.
Right, and they have to ensure that the income and property from each WAC is used only for the purposes that were originally intended. No funny business, no misuse of funds.
So they're responsible for safeguarding the assets and making sure they're used for the right reasons.
Exactly. And they have the power to set up the management schemes for each WAC, like who's responsible for what, how are decisions made, that sort of thing.
So they're laying down the rules, the framework for how each WAC should be run.
Yep, and they also give general directions on how WAQF should be administered. Like, they can issue guidelines or instructions to mutawalis to ensure consistency and best practices.
So they're not just passively overseeing things, they're actively involved in shaping how WAQF are managed.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is financial oversight. They have to scrutinize and approve the budgets submitted by mutawalis.
Making sure the money is being spent wisely and there's no mismanagement or corruption.
Exactly. And they arrange for regular audits of the WAC accounts to keep everything above board.
It sounds like they're taking their financial responsibilities seriously.
They are. And then there's the power to appoint and remove mutawalis.
So if a mutawali isn't doing their job properly, the board can step in and replace them.
Exactly. They have that authority. And that's a crucial power because it ensures accountability. If a mutawali is mismanaging a WAC, the board can hold them responsible.
So the mutawalis know they can't just do whatever they want. They have to answer to the board.
Right. And the board's powers go beyond that. They can take action to recover any WAC property that's been lost or encroached upon.
So if someone's illegally occupying WAC land, the board can step in and get it back.
Exactly. And they can also initiate and defend legal proceedings related to WAQF, so they can go to court to protect the interests of the WAF.
So they have real legal clout. They're not just a toothless advisory body.
Not at all. And one of their key responsibilities is dealing with leases of immovable WAF property.
So if someone wants to lease, say, some land that belongs to a WAF, the board has to approve it.
That's right. And it's not a simple rubber stamp either. The Act requires a 2/3 majority vote from the board members to approve any lease.
So there are checks and balances in place to make sure these decisions aren't taken lightly.
Exactly. It's about safeguarding the WAC property. And they also manage the WAC fund, which is a pool of money used for various purposes that benefit WAQF as a whole.
Okay, so they're managing finances on a larger scale as well, not just for individual WAQF.
Right. And they can demand information and returns from mutawalis. They can inspect WAF properties and records. They can even conduct surveys to determine the nature and extent of WAC property.
Wow, they've got their hands full. They're really involved in every aspect of WAC management.
They are. And one final power, they can determine the fair market rent for any land or buildings that belong to a WAF.
So they have the authority to set rental rates. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's all about ensuring that the WAF property is being used and managed in a way that benefits the intended purpose.
All right, so the boards are clearly very powerful, very important, but how do these WAQF actually get recognized and brought under the board's umbrella?
Good question. That's where the registration process comes in. Chapter 5 of the Act is all about how WAQF are registered. And the Act makes it mandatory for every WAC, whether it was created before the Act came into effect or after, to be registered with the relevant WAF board.
So every single WAC has to be registered, no exceptions.
Nope. And the main responsibility for getting that done falls on the Mutawali.
So the manager of the WAC has to take the initiative and apply for registration.
That's right. But the Act does provide some flexibility. The application can also be made by the original WAQF, their descendants, any beneficiary of the WAQ, or even just any Muslim who belongs to the same sect as the WAQ.
So there are multiple avenues. It's not solely reliant on the Mutawali, which is good because what if the Mutawali is negligent or something?
Exactly. It ensures that the registration process isn't held hostage by a single person.
Okay, so let's say someone's applying for registration. What kind of information do they need to provide?
Well, they need to give a detailed description of the WAQ property itself. So if it's land, they need to provide details about its size, location, boundaries, that sort of thing. If it's buildings, they need to describe the structures, their condition, etc. And if it's movable property like jewelry or cash, they need to provide an inventory.
So a full picture of what's being dedicated as WAQF.
Right. And they also need to provide information about the WAQF's income, if it's generating any taxes that are payable on it.
So the board gets a clear understanding of the financial aspect of the WAQ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But perhaps the most important information is about the origins and the objectives of the WAQF. They need to explain how and when it was created, who the original WAQF was, and most importantly, what the specific purpose of the WAQ is.
So what charitable or religious activities is it supposed to support?
Precisely. That's crucial because it helps the board understand how the WAQ should be managed and ensures that it's used in accordance with the WAQF's wishes.
So it's not just about the property itself, it's about understanding the intent behind the dedication.
Exactly. It's about preserving the spirit of the WAQ.
Now, once a WAQ is registered, where is all this information kept?
Well, the board keeps it all in a central register of WAQF. It's basically a big database that contains all the key information about each WAQ that's registered with them.
So it's like a comprehensive record of all the WAQF under the board's jurisdiction.
Yep. It includes copies of the original WAF deeds, the names and addresses of the current mutawalis, the rules for how succession will work when a mutawali needs to be replaced, detailed information about the WAC properties, and the approved schemes for how each WAC is to be administered.
Wow, it's like a one-stop shop for all things WAF.
You could say that. And to make sure everything's properly documented on the land records as well, they also forward all these details to the relevant local land record office.
So it's all linked up, no discrepancies or confusion about what land or property belongs to a WAF?
Exactly. It's about transparency and accountability.
All right, so we've got our WAF registered. We know who the mutawali is. What are their specific duties, their responsibilities under the Act?
Well, Section 50 of the Act lays out those obligations pretty clearly. First and foremost, they have to follow all the lawful directions that come from the WAC board.
So the board is their boss, basically. They have to follow their instructions.
You could say that. They have to see the board as the supervisory authority. They also have to regularly provide the board with all the necessary information and returns.
So keeping the board updated on the status of the WAC, how things are running, that sort of thing?
Exactly. Transparency is key. And they have to allow authorized people from the board to inspect the WAF properties and check the records.
So no hiding anything, everything's open to scrutiny.
That's right. And of course, they're responsible for making sure all the public dues related to the WAC property are paid. So things like property taxes, any other levies, all that has to be taken care of.
So they're basically managing the WAC's finances responsibly.
Exactly. And generally, they have to comply with any other lawful requirements that are laid out in the Act or in the rules that are framed under the Act.
So they have a pretty significant list of responsibilities.
They do. It's a position of trust, and the Act makes that clear.
Now let's talk about the WAC property itself. Can the mutawali just do whatever they want with it?
Absolutely not. The Act puts some very strict limitations on what they can do. In fact, Section 51 specifically says that any attempt to alienate immovable WAF property is void unless it's been sanctioned by the board.
Alienate. What does that mean in this context?
It means to transfer ownership or possession of the property. So selling it, gifting it, exchanging it, mortgaging it, anything like that.
So basically the mutawali can't just sell off the WAC land or building. They need the board's permission.
Exactly. And that permission isn't a given. They have to make a strong case for why it's in the best interests of the WAF.
So it's a safeguard against mismanagement or unauthorized disposal of WAF assets.
It is. And there are even specific restrictions on how long WAC property can be leased out, particularly for agricultural land.
So they can't just lease it out for decades and forget about it.
Right. And if they want to lease out any immovable property for more than 30 years, they need the board's approval for that too.
It's all about ensuring that the WAF property is being used in a way that aligns with its original purpose.
It's exactly protecting the long-term interests of the WAC.
Now, we've talked about the responsibilities of the boards, the duties of the mutawalis. But what happens if there are disagreements, disputes, legal issues that arise?
Well, the Act has the solution for that too. Chapter 8 sets up special tribunals to handle any judicial proceedings that involve WAQF.
So it's like a separate court system specifically for WAC matters?
You could say that. These tribunals are made up of a panel of experts, including a judicial member who's at least a district judge or equivalent, an officer from the state civil services who's at least an additional district magistrate rank, and a member who's knowledgeable about Muslim law.
So it's a mix of legal expertise and understanding of the religious context.
Exactly. And these tribunals function as civil courts. They have the power to hear cases, make judgments, issue decrees, the whole 9 yards.
So if there's a dispute about a WAC property or someone's not fulfilling their obligations, the tribunal can step in and resolve it.
That's right. And here's the important part. Regular civil courts are barred from interfering in any matter that falls under the jurisdiction of these WAC tribunals.
So it's a dedicated system, keeping WAC matters within a specialized forum.
Precisely.
Now, what if someone's unhappy with the decision made by the tribunal? Is there any avenue for appeal?
Well, generally speaking, the tribunal's decisions are final. But the Act does allow for a high court to review the records of the tribunal's proceedings.
So it's not a complete dead end. There's a possibility of some higher level scrutiny.
There is. But that review is usually limited to checking if the tribunal followed the correct procedures, if their decision was lawful and proper. It's not about retrying the whole case.
Well, it's more about ensuring the process was fair and legal, not about second-guessing the tribunal's judgment.
Right. And on top of that, the tribunal has the power to assess damages if someone's been illegally occupying WAQF property. And they can penalize those encroachers too.
So there are real consequences for those who violate the Act.
Absolutely. The Act has teeth.
Now, as we wrap things up, I noticed there are some sections towards the end of the Act that seem particularly strong in terms of protecting WAQF property. Sections 104A, 104B, and 108A specifically. Can you talk about those?
Sure. These are some key provisions that really solidify the Act's commitment to safeguarding WAC assets.
They seem to be laying down the law, making it very clear what's allowed and what's not.
Exactly. So Section 104A is a big one. It outright bans the sale, gift, exchange, mortgage, or any other type of transfer of any WAC property to any other person. It doesn't matter if it's movable property like jewelry or movable property like land or buildings. It's all covered.
So no selling off WAP assets, no giving them away, no sneaky transfers. It's a blanket prohibition.
Yep. And the Act goes even further. It says any such transaction is void from the very beginning, what they call void ab initio in legal terms.
So it's like it never happened. It's completely invalid no matter what.
Exactly. No loopholes. And then you've got Section 104B, which tackles the issue of WAC properties that might be occupied by government agencies.
So if a government department is using a WAF building or some land, that section comes into play.
Right. And it says that if the WAC tribunal issues an order for the property to be restored back to the WAC, the government agency has to comply within 6 months. No ifs, ands, or buts.
So even the government can't just hold on to WAC property indefinitely. They have to follow the law.
Exactly. And finally, Section 108A is like the trump card. It's what's called an overriding effect clause. What that means is, if there's any other law that contradicts the WAC Act wins.
So the WAF Act takes precedence over everything else when it comes to WAC matters.
That's right. It establishes the Act as the ultimate authority in this domain.
So these final sections really reinforce the Act's intention to protect WAF properties from being misused, alienated, or encroached upon, even by powerful entities like the government.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that these assets are preserved and used for their intended purposes, for the benefit of the community.
All right, so as we come to the end of this deep dive, it's clear that the WAQF Act of 1995 is a comprehensive and significant piece of legislation. It creates a whole framework for the structured administration and oversight of WAQF across India.
We've covered a lot of ground. We looked at the definitions of key terms like WAQF, and mutawali. We explored the powers and functions of the WAQF boards. We delved into the registration process. And we even touched upon the judicial system that's been set up to handle WAQF-related disputes.
And those strong provisions we just discussed, those restrictions on selling or transferring WAQF property, and the mechanisms for recovering encroached land really highlight the Act's commitment to protecting these assets.
It's a complex piece of legislation, but hopefully we've managed to give you a clear and concise understanding of its key aspects.
And here's something for you to ponder as we sign off. How does this comprehensive legal framework actually impact the beneficiaries of these WAQF? And how does it affect the wider Muslim community in India?
It's an interesting question. On the one hand, the Act brings structure, accountability, and protection to the management of WAQF. But on the other hand, it also introduces a level of bureaucracy and potentially even some limitations on what mutawalis and communities can do with WAQF property.
Food for thought indeed. Now, for those who want to delve even deeper, I'd recommend checking out specific case studies that have been decided by the WAC tribunals.
Or you could take a look at the rules and regulations that your own state government has framed under this Act. Those will give you a really granular view of how the Act is being implemented on the ground.
And of course, the Central WAC Council's website is a treasure trove of information, so don't hesitate to explore further.
Okay, so you guys have sent in a ton of stuff about these changes to WAQF laws in India.
Yeah.
And wow, this is a lot to unpack.
It is.
So let's just dive right in and see what we can figure out today.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, we have to start with what even is a WAQF?
Yeah, so a WAQF is basically like a religious endowment under Islamic law,
Yeah.
and it's meant to kind of support charitable activities, good causes, helping out the community, that sort of thing.
Okay, so kind of like a charitable trust in a way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just about property. It's got this kind of deeper social and religious purpose.
Okay, so then let's go back to 2013. There were some important amendments to the WAQF Act back then. What was the point of those changes?
Well, the 2013 amendments were really trying to kind of bolster the original WAQF Act from back in 1995, and a big focus was on making sure they could deal with disputes over WAQF properties more efficiently.
Yeah.
So they wanted to give more power to these WAQF tribunals who are, the ones who sort out these disagreements. And then they also set up this central WAQF council to keep an eye on all the different state WAQF boards.
Right, and from what I've been reading, it seems like encroachment on WAQF land was a really big deal back then. Was that part of the reason for those changes?
Oh, absolutely. Encroachment was a huge problem, and the 2013 amendments were definitely trying to tackle that head on.
Makes sense.
They wanted to give those tribunals more teeth, so they could actually enforce their decisions. And the Central WAQF Council was supposed to make sure that all the state boards were on top of things like, keeping track of their finances, making sure surveys of WAQF properties were happening regularly, and of course trying to stop people from just taking over WAQF land.
So did they actually put any new penalties in place for people who were encroaching on WAQF property?
Yeah, they did, actually. So under the 2013 amendment, anyone caught illegally occupying or buying WAQF property could face up to 2 years in jail.
Wow. Okay, serious consequences.
Yeah, they were serious about protecting these properties, and they also took away the WAQF board's right to sell or give away WAQF land.
So basically no more getting rid of those endowed properties.
Exactly. And they even shortened the time between surveys of WAQF properties from 20 years to just 10 years so they could keep a much closer eye on everything.
Wow, that's a big change. So what was the reaction like back then when these amendments came out? Were people generally supportive?
It's interesting. One of the sources you sent actually mentions that this BJP MP, Shahnawaz Hussain, was pretty happy about it at the time.
Okay.
He said he thought it would really help cut down on the encroachment problem because apparently there was just tons of WAQF property tied up in these legal battles.
Wow.
So at least some people were on board with it, especially when it came to tackling that encroachment issue.
Now, there was one thing in the 2013 Act that really caught my eye, and that was this Section 108A. Can you explain what that was all about?
Yeah, so Section 108A was basically like a trump card for the WAQF Act.
A trump card. How?
Well, it said that if there was ever any conflict between the WAQF Act and any other law in the country, the WAQF Act would always win out.
Oh, wow. So it basically superseded everything else.
Yeah, basically. So it gave the WAQF Act a lot of power.
Okay, so that's the 2013 amendment. Now let's fast forward to the new WAQF bill from 2025.
Right.
Seems like it keeps some stuff from the old amendment, but also shakes things up quite a bit. So what are the biggest changes we should know about?
Well, the first thing, and probably the most important, is that they completely got rid of Section 108A.
Wait, really? So that overriding effect is totally gone?
Yep, that's a major change. It means that the WAC Act doesn't automatically trump other laws anymore, so, that changes things quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a big deal. So what else is different?
Well, they've also changed how WACs are actually formed, like they now officially recognize Aga Khani and Bora WACs on top of the Shia and Sunni ones that were already recognized.
Okay, so they're broadening the types of WACs,
Yeah.
but I also noticed there's some new restrictions on who can actually create a WAQF, right?
Yeah, that's right now you have to have been practicing Islam for at least 5 years, and you have to actually own the property you're dedicating as a waqf.
Okay, so it's a bit stricter than before.
Definitely. And they also got rid of this thing called WAF by user.
WAQF by user, what's that?
So basically, before, if there was like an old mosque or a shrine or a graveyard that the Muslim community had been using for ages, even if there weren't any official ownership documents, they could still say it was WAF property just because it had always been used that way.
Okay.
But now that's gone. So if there's no paperwork, you can't just claim something as WAF anymore just because it's been used by the community.
So that could be a problem for a lot of these really old religious sites that might not have all the paperwork in order?
Exactly. It could be a big issue.
Gotcha. Okay, so what about the WAC tribunals? The 2013 amendments made them more powerful, but it seems like the new bill is kind of pulling back on that a bit.
Yeah, you could say so before the tribunals had the final say in any dispute, but the new bill doesn't say that anymore. And now there's this new rule that if there isn't a tribunal set up in a certain area or if it doesn't have enough members, people can just go straight to the high court.
So they can kind of bypass the tribunal altogether.
Exactly. So yeah, the tribunals might not have as much power as they used to.
Okay. And what about the WAC boards themselves? Who actually gets to be on those boards now?
Well, this is a big one. They're now required to have non-Muslim members on both the central and the state WAC boards. 2 on each, actually.
Wow, that's a huge change.
It is, and they've also changed the rules about removing the chairperson of a board. The old act had a whole process for that, but it's completely gone in the new bill.
Yeah.
And get this, they also took out the requirement that the chief executive officer of a WAC board had to be Muslim.
Wow, so the CEO could be non-Muslim now.
Yep, although they kept the same appointment process as before.
Okay, interesting. So apart from the membership changes,
Yeah.
are there any other big administrative shifts in the new bill?
Yeah. Definitely, they've given a lot more power to district collectors. Now they can actually decide who owns a property if there's a dispute about whether it's WAC or not.
So the government's got more say now.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And there's also a big push for digitizing all the WAF records and setting up this online portal to manage all that information.
Okay, I see. And there's another thing you mentioned before that I wanted to dig into a bit more. The fact that the Limitation Act will now apply to WAQF property claims. What does that mean in practice?
Well, basically it means there's now a time limit on when you can take legal action over a WAC property.
Okay, so you can't just wait forever to make a claim.
Exactly. And this is another thing that sparked a lot of debate. They've completely removed Section 40 from the original WAF Act of 1995.
Yeah, Section 40 seems to be a real hot-button issue. What was it about that section that caused so much controversy?
Well, Section 40 basically gave the WAF board a lot of leeway to investigate whether a property was actually WAF or not. And some people claim that some state WAC boards were abusing that power to just declare private land as WAC without really having a strong case.
Oh, wow. That would definitely cause problems.
Yeah, it led to tons of legal challenges and a lot of tension in communities, and the government says that's why they got rid of it, to stop that kind of thing from happening and to make it clear who owns what.
Okay, so after all that, I guess the big question is why introduce this new bill in the first place? What was the government hoping to achieve?
Well, according to them, it's all about making things more transparent, being more inclusive, and just generally making the whole system of managing WAC properties more efficient.
Okay, but they also seem to be pretty critical of the 2013 amendments, right?
Oh, yeah. They've said that those amendments were way too extreme and that they were basically just a way for the previous government to appease certain groups.
Interesting. And what specific problems are they saying this new bill is designed to solve?
Well, they're basically saying that both the original 1995 Act and the 2013 amendments just didn't work. They say there are still people illegally squatting on WAC land, lots of ownership disputes dragging on forever, and a whole backlog of property registrations and surveys.
Okay.
And they also claim that the judicial oversight wasn't good enough under the old system because it wasn't always easy to appeal a tribunal's decision to a higher court.
Makes sense.
They're also worried about these incomplete surveys of WAQF properties across the country, and they say that Section 40 was being misused to stir up trouble between communities. Plus, they're even questioning whether parts of the WAQF Act are actually constitutional. They mentioned a public interest litigation that was filed in the Delhi High Court about that.
Wow, they've really thrown the whole kitchen sink at this thing, huh?
Yeah, it seems like it. And you know what else? The current Minister for Minority Affairs, this guy Kiran Rijiju, he actually said that the bill is based on recommendations from the Sakhar Committee.
Wait, the Sakhar committee that was set up way back when to look at how Muslims were doing in India socially and economically?
Yep.
That's the one. So they're saying this is all part of a bigger plan to improve things for minorities.
Oh, okay, well, that brings us to another big debate, whether the old WAQF Act and its amendments actually led to all this mismanagement of WAQF resources. What's the government's take on that?
Well, they're basically saying, yes, they think the old system was a mess, and they point to all the stuff we just talked about, the illegal occupation, the disputes, the slow surveys. They say it's all proof that things weren't working.
Okay, but do they have any specific examples or evidence to back that up?
Well, one of the sources you sent, the Dishbak, it mentions this statistic that there are something like 4.9 lakh WAQF properties in India, but they only generate about 163 crore rupees in income.
Wow, so they're saying that's way too low considering how much property there is.
Yeah, they think those assets could be way more productive, and they're saying if they could manage things better, all that extra money could be used to help poor Muslims with things like education and healthcare.
So they're trying to make the case that this is all about helping the Muslim community in the long run. Exactly, that's their argument.
But I'm guessing the opposition parties and other critics don't quite buy that.
Nope, they definitely have a different perspective.
So what are they saying?
Well, according to the Deshbach, they're saying, hang on a second. This government's been in power for 10 years now. If things were so bad, why didn't they fix it sooner?
Okay, so they're calling out the government's own record.
Yeah, they're basically saying you've had plenty of time to sort this out if you really wanted to.
Right.
And they're also pointing the finger back at the government, saying that government encroachment on WAQF land has also been a problem. They even bring up the Sakhar Committee report again, basically saying the government's been part of the problem.
So they're turning the government's argument back on them.
Pretty much. And they also have another point. They're saying all this talk about needing to digitize everything and do new surveys doesn't really add up.
How so?
Well, apparently the government itself told the Supreme Court back in 2020 that almost all WAQF properties, like 99%, had already been digitized.
Oh, wow. So that does seem a bit contradictory.
Yeah, the opposition's saying if it's already digitized, why do we need to do it all again? They think there might be another agenda at play here.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Another big issue here is whether the central government is overstepping its bounds with all this. Are they getting too involved in WAQF matters that have traditionally been handled by the Muslim community?
Yeah, a lot of people are saying that.
So what are their main concerns?
Well, they're really worried about these non-Muslim members being forced onto the WAQF boards.
I can see why that would be controversial.
Yeah, they're saying that WAQFs are supposed to be managed by Muslims according to Islamic principles, and this new rule is a direct interference in their religious autonomy.
Okay.
And the opposition, they're even more suspicious. They think the government's trying to slowly take control of all these WAQF institutions.
Wow, so they think this is part of a bigger power grab.
Yep. And another thing that's raising eyebrows is giving all this power to district collectors to decide who owns disputed properties. They're saying that's way too much government involvement in something that should be handled within the Muslim community.
So it's basically a clash between the government saying they're trying to streamline things and make them more efficient, and critics saying this is all about control.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's getting pretty heated.
So how are Muslims in India reacting to this whole thing? Do they see it as a threat to their religious identity?
Well, judging from the stuff you sent, it seems like there's a lot of anxiety and distrust in the community.
Yeah, I can imagine.
They're really worried about those non-Muslim members on the WAQF boards, and they're also scared that all these new rules about proving ownership are going to put a lot of old WAQF properties at risk, things like mosques and shrines and graveyards that have been around for centuries, but might not have all the paperwork up to date. And the opposition is saying this could basically open the floodgates for anyone to challenge the ownership of any old mosque or grave, which could lead to tons of lawsuits and just create a lot of chaos and uncertainty.
Wow. Okay, and we've seen reports of protests too, right?
Yeah, you sent me that CNBC TV 18 transcript that mentioned protests, which definitely shows that at least some people are actively against the bill.
Right.
And there was an interesting quote from the ANI News transcript where this guy said that Muslims aren't enemies or servants of India, they're owners, and they just want everyone to progress together.
Yeah, that definitely hints at this feeling of being marginalized or even targeted by this new law.
Absolutely.
So with all this concern and opposition, is there a chance this bill could actually lead to more unrest and tension between communities?
Well, the government's saying that some state WAQF boards have been misusing their power in the past and that that's actually been causing tension, so they're claiming this bill is meant to fix that.
Okay, I see their point.
But the opposition is saying the exact opposite. They're worried that this bill could actually trigger more unrest by potentially leading to all these legal challenges over old religious sites and practices.
So they're saying it could actually make things worse.
Yeah, and you even sent me that article from the Deshbach where they talk about these Jai Shri Ram slogans being chanted in parliament after discussions about Muslim women and Pasmanda Muslims.
And that was pretty concerning.
Right. It does make you wonder if this whole issue could be used to further polarize things.
Okay, so then we get to maybe the most serious question of all. Is this all just a way to deepen the divide between Hindus and Muslims in India?
Well, that's exactly what the opposition is accusing the government of doing.
Really?
Yeah, they're saying this is all part of the BJP's strategy to kind of stoke the flames and create more division along religious lines.
So they're saying it's more about politics than good governance.
That's their take on it. But of course, the government denies that they're saying this is all about benefiting minorities and making sure WAQF properties are managed properly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. To sum it all up, the new WAQF bill makes some pretty big changes from the 2013 amendment. The WAQF Act doesn't have that special overriding status anymore.
Yeah.
There are new rules about forming WAQFs and who can be on the boards, and there's a lot more government oversight now through those district collectors.
Yep. And let's not forget about the Limitation Act applying to WAQF property disputes. Now, that's a big deal.
Right. Good point. So basically, the government is arguing that all this will lead to better transparency and efficiency. But a lot of people, especially in the Muslim community, are really worried that it's going to erode their religious freedom and that the new rules could be misused.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, and it's definitely not over yet. You mentioned that some political parties are planning to challenge the law in the Supreme Court.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see what happens next. But for now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, what do you make of these new changes?
Do you think this new law will ultimately be good or bad for India? Will it really improve how religious properties are managed? Or will it just create more division and unrest?
It's a really tough question with a lot of different angles to consider.
Exactly. So we want you to keep thinking about this and do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See ya.